Assalamu alaikum and welcome to another episode of Sultans and Sneakers. I'm your host, Mahin the podcaster. And usually I don't do a lot of these video intros for my episodes, but I wanted to do one for this episode just to give the listeners and the viewers some kind of context. So, my guest today is an individual by the name of John Kaiser. And I'm interviewing him about a book that he wrote called Commander of the Faithful, the life and times of Emir Abd el-Kader. Emir Abd el-Kader, as many people may know or may not know of him, was a 19th century. Um, he was a political leader, a Islamic scholar, a Sufi mystic, as they say, and he became he's known as eventually the founding father of Algeria, modern day Algeria, even though Algeria was founded many years after his passing. He is credited with laying the groundwork for that, especially in his resistance against the French colonizers of his time. Um, so I actually had only heard about Emir Abdul Kader prior to meeting John, um, in this context of the city of El Kader, Iowa, or I think they pronounce it El Kader, which is a friend of mine had told me about. And that city is a small town in eastern Iowa that's named after him. And it's been named after him for well over 100 years. So it's not like a new thing, so to speak. Because I think there was I think a politician or attorney in like Dubuque, Iowa, which is in eastern Iowa, was inspired by Emir Abdul Qadir's resistance against the French. It is an American back in the 1800s, and then that's how. Long story short, is the city got its name. So I met John um, at the ISNA convention in Chicago in September of 2022. This past year's ISNA. Um, and then I also met a lady by the name of Kathy Garms who lives in Al Qaeda, and she works with John. And they had a little presentation about the book and Emir Abdul Kader. And what interested me about John was he's a guy who's like a basic, like East, I think he's born in Chicago, but he calls himself, he's like a typical WASP, as he describes himself. Former corporate business career, has a master's from Columbia, MBA from the University of Chicago. He's now in his, I think, his late 70s, or maybe even be 80, if I recall correctly. And now he's just retired, and he raises pigs in a farm in Virginia. So he's kind of like a pig farmer. Um, and the Emir is maybe I was thinking about the title for the show. Um, so that's so I interviewed John about some aspects of the Emir's life specifically, and we broke it down into two parts because of his schedule. And there's certain ethics that I think appeal to John. So the thing about John is when John heard about the Emir, he really fell in love with him and really was attracted to him. I disagree with some of his, I think, interpretations of the Emir's religious inclinations, as you guys will see in the episode. But just to put it out there, I think there's a when it comes to religion, there's this whole idea of pluralism and coexistence and all that. And the Emir, I think, does a great job of that when he's encountering, from the, dealing with the French. Because when you read the book, you realize he starts from a village in Algeria, right? And then he encounters people of other faiths throughout his life, and he's able to like interact with them and coexist and befriend them, and like even vouch for their safety. Sometimes there was an incident where there was going to be some Christian persecution, and the Emir was able to step in and prevent that from happening. When a lot of people would just kind of let it slide. So he is a model in that sense, but sometimes I think he gets conflated with this, like what they call the perennialist ideology is kind of imposed on it. Now, John, I don't think is familiar with the perennialist ideology, but it's the ideology that all faiths, or universalism, that all faiths are equal in that sense, right? Now, when you read the book and you see the context of where the Emir gets some of these ideas from, he's heavily influenced by Sheikh al-Akbar Muhyiddin ibn al-Arabi, right? And those of us who know, who have teachers who are well read in Ibn Arabi will usually say that Ibn Arabi is someone who should not be read by the novice, um, because the way he writes, um, it's very easy to get confused. Unfortunately, he's very popular in like Western circles, I think, because people can kind of spin his stuff in the way they find convenient. So I think that's what's kind of happening here is that the emirs, he like his understand like how it's perceived that he values all faiths equally, or they're all valid, so to speak. I think that's what the perennialist mantra kind of is, maybe interpreted by how they show his relationship with interpreting Ibn Arabi. And Ibn Arabi himself, I've never heard him being accused of being a perennialist, right? But the stuff that is emphasized is, the value, how he treats the common man, the value of ethics, and how God does reveal himself in different ways to people, because we all are different in that sense. But at the end of the day, the Quran says that indeed the only religion acceptable to Allah is Islam. So that is ultimately the guy, and the Emir being an Islamic scholar, obviously he was aware of that. So I just wanted to offer that clarification, in case anybody got some kind of was confused by the interview in that sense. Also, if you read the book, I do recommend reading the book. I think that if you listen to this podcast, you may not, I'm not sure how much you'll get out of it without eventually going back and reading the book. So I'd go on Amazon and you can purchase the book there. You can also learn more about John at johnwkaiser.com. He's written other books. I was hoping to speak with him about some of his other writings and his writing style. And ultimately, what I appreciated about John is that you got a guy who's had a successful corporate career, and then he gets passionate about a subject, and he really dives deep into it to the point of being able to write this great book. And this whole channel is about helping American Muslim men like live the deep life, and I think John, even as a non-Muslim, exemplifies that. You know what I'm saying? So I think that's what drew me to him for this channel. And so I hope you guys enjoy the episode. If you have any questions or comments, you can email me at info@sultansandsneakers.com. So without further ado, let's get into the episode. And again, there's a part 1 and the part 2 broken up, 2 different sections, but I just combined them into one recording. Take care. Assalamu alaikum. Assalamu alaikum and welcome to another episode of Sultans and Sneakers. I'm your host, as always, Mahin the podcaster, and I am honored today to be joined by John W. Kaiser, author of Commander of the Faithful. And John, I had met John at the ISNA convention back in Chicago, back in September here in Chicago, and had a chance to watch his presentation on Emir Abd el-Kader, who I actually knew nothing about. And I will say that, John, I've done 300 or so interviews in my podcasting life. This is the first time I've actually read a book in preparation for an interview.
Well, I hope that's good.
Yeah. If you could you move your camera a little bit, because half your face is cutting off. Yeah, that's perfect. Good. Yeah, you're good. You're good there. You're good there. So I want to kind of start. You didn't talk about this in the presentation, but you kind of briefly highlighted your backstory. I know you raised pigs as a hobby out in Virginia, and I know you had a business career in the past. But just to get started, before we get into Emir Abd el-Kader, I'd like to explore a little bit about your own background to give some context and what resonated so well with you about him. Like, tell me about a little bit your upbringing, your education, and what you did for a living prior to learning about Emir Abd el-Kader.
Well, that's an important question, because a lot of people wonder why a waspy Northeasterner went to Groton School got pulled into this subject. And the short answer is that I think throughout my life, I've always been a little bit of a I tend to go against the current. So when everybody says it's this way, I tend to think, well, maybe it's the other way too. So we don't too much mutual exclusivity that goes on in our judgments about things. And I was in school during the Cold War. I was in graduate school at Columbia, University of Chicago Business School, and then I also graduated from the University of North Carolina, all of which were, not all of which, but most of which were reflections of my desire not to go to Vietnam, because I didn't see any real value in that. In fact, I thought it was a huge, horrible mistake, which it obviously was. And then after that, we were bombarded for another 20 years by our government and our so-called opinion leaders that the greatest threat in the world was Russia, and they were the enemy, and that would keep feeding the industrial complex. And so what I learned in the first 15, 20 years after I graduated from academia, I was basically challenging a lot of preconceptions about Russia. And one of the preconceptions was, okay, yes, they do have satellites and got some of their space technology ahead of us, but you can't work with them. If they have technology, they wouldn't sell it, and they're secretive and blah blah blah. So I thought, well, I mean, maybe they are, maybe they aren't, or maybe they're both. Most things are both anyway. And I came across the idea when we were bashing Russia to see whether they had technologies that they were selling to us, because then we were bad guys if we were selling to the bad guys. So we have to see if they're how broad is this picture. So I did some research and wrote an article for Foreign Policy magazine. This was in 1970, I think 5 or 6, and I had done some research, and the research was to go to the Commerce Department and ask them if the Russians had been selling intellectual property to American companies. And they said, well, I don't know. We'll go look in our files and see what information we have. Well, it turns out that they had the Russians had actually been selling very advanced industrial technologies to countries all over the world, including the U.S. Well, that was really a shock to the Washington crowd, because they had this condescending attitude towards Russia. And an article was published in Foreign Policy magazine, and that was picked up by all kinds of government people in Washington. And they said, well, tell us more about this. This isn't supposed to happen. The Russians don't do this kind of thing. And it turned out, well, yes, they do. So I started a little company called Kaiser Research, and we still have some of the products from that toe dip into Russian technological achievement. And so for 15, well, a good 15 years, had a small group, and we went over to Russia, explained who we were, why we were there, wanted to see what technologies they'd be willing to sell. And I'm talking about intellectual property.
And this is like late 70s, 80s?
Yeah, late 70s, 80s, up to 90, well, the collapse of the wall.
Okay.
So people would come to me and say, well, how do you do that? I mean, the Russians aren't supposed to have stuff. And what do you do? I said, well, what you do is you challenge the preconception, and then you go try it out. And found out that that they are very cooperative if you're just honest. I went to the KGB guy in New York, and I said, this is what I'm doing for U.S., and can you help me identify companies on our side who are benefiting from your technology? And he said, yeah. And who wants to know? I said, well, Commerce Department, CIA, National Science Foundation, DOD, everybody wants to know, because this is supposed to be happening. This is counter reality. And so put a little team together and went to the embassy and said, this is what our agenda is. And for the next, I don't know, I guess it was over 10 years, 15 years, a lot of it was down in the Donbass today. they had, they were making plastic submarines. They were doing all kinds of incredible stuff that really had people interested. And then the wall came down, and I didn't find it that interesting anymore. I liked it more when it was more coat and dagger. But you follow a few simple rules, which is don't go to the U.S. Embassy because you're automatically, zapped by the cameras. And also, it was just more exciting, frankly. And then I wasn't interested in potato chips and Coca-Cola sales. So that's when I thought, well, let's try another slice of life here. And at that time, after the Russian threat had seemingly melted away, that we had the new enemy, of course, which was this Bush said the Islam thing, since he couldn't think of a better way of describing Islam than the Islam thing. And as somebody who myself, I was not particularly religiously oriented in my, I don't even know what that phrase means, but religion and the Bible and scripture hadn't really been a big part of my life, other than with a lot of so-called Christians. It's more of you go to church, you go to Easter, you have the cookies, you socialize, and you try to get right with God for a couple of hours or days, or change your life. All kinds of things can happen when you start getting serious about your relationship with the higher power. But at this point, I just wanted to look at Islam in the same way that others in the past had looked at Russia, which is monolithic. They're all bad. Can't trust them. And of course, in this case, the distance was even greater, since there were fewer and fewer people in my world who actually had friends who were Muslims. But that started to change. Was the most obvious thing is you meet them and you bring them into your life. And the first way that happened was hiring. I think she was I forget which country in Africa, but she was took care of my kids as a babysitter. And that's a little bit more than a babysitter, but in any event, she was wonderful. Mohammed, actually, she was from Somalia.
Okay.
And married a guy from Harvard. But in any event, they were wonderful people, and but still a small toe dip. And hearing about the Quran and this and that, and what it does, what it doesn't do. And so I thought, well, I've been at the technology business for it was almost 15 years. I'm ready for a change. I like languages. When I was in college, I studied French, German, Russian, and because that helps open doors, and I like to go into the doors that most people don't go through. So I found that as my mechanism, my investment in technology was learning languages. Today, my Russian isn't so great, and neither is my French, but it works most of the time. So I thought, well, what do I do to get a change of life here? And my wife and I thought we both liked France, and had been there, and I liked the idea of going to France for many reasons. One of which was here'd be an opportunity for me to learn something not only about French culture, but more importantly, in today's world, then learn something about Muslims and who they are and what they believe and why are they a threat and all of that. So we settled in a village outside of Nice, and I befriended a Catholic priest. And the reason I befriended him was, among other things, in my technology phase of my life, I had come to recognize that there was a lot of wisdom in Scripture. And how did that happen? Well, it happened because of a conversation I had with a aluminum manufacturer in what do you call it, in California. Kaiser aluminum, actually. They were big in Russia. And I said, what really makes things tick in your business? And basically he said, it's not the technology, it's people. And you can have the best technology, but if they're on strike or they're working against you because they hate your management, or they're not, it's the relationships that really make things happen. So in this case, in answer to my question, they said, it was our oldest plant with the oldest technology out in Washington that had the highest return on investment, because the new one in West Virginia was being run by people out of Boston who didn't understand the Mountain Boys and how they functioned. They were on strike. They were always sabotaging things. So it was the old technology that did better than the new technology, but it's an attitude, and it's all relationship based. If you don't have good relationships with people, you're not going to get very far. Well, no matter what you're doing, unless you're a monk who lives in the desert, or a theoretical mathematician. But most of us need people to actuate. So that's when I thought I'd pick up the Bible and do a little reading, get somewhat literate. And the part of the Bible that I got to first, which flows perfectly into this discussion, really is that there's a hell of a lot of wisdom in the Bible, in the scriptures, and particularly in the Old Testament, and particularly in those that are most sort of neutral as far as source. I mean, you have.
By the way, John, I think there's a tapping sound coming up from your mic sometimes. I don't know if there's something being hit over there.
Yeah, you're right. I'm tapping with my fingers.
I gotcha. Okay.
Yeah,
it comes through on the mic pretty strong.
Sorry about that. So
no problem.
So I just remember after reading Proverbs and Ecclesiastes, a word softly spoken turns away wrath. I mean, this is good stuff. I mean, there's no question. If somebody yelling at you and you don't yell back, you bring the temperature down real fast.
Right.
How many of us can do that? So I thought, it's really sad that we don't teach more of this kind of wisdom, irrespective of your affiliations in ourselves. There's wisdom. So anyway, but there are a lot of things I didn't understand. And this Catholic priest, he put together some little sessions with local Muslims, because I told him I'd like to meet Muslims, and so we had a gathering and for a day, and we talked about what do Catholics believe and what do Muslims believe, and we said, my God, we believe the same thing. The only difference is they have one extra prophet, and he's not God. He's but the five pillars, the attitude towards Jesus, towards Mary, it just tore away all of the. Wow, this is. What's the big deal? But then I wasn't devoted to any particular view of Christianity or truth, and so this is interesting.
Sure.
And I would ask occasionally young Muslims and say, well, what is it? What does it mean to be a Christians go to heaven, and it's up to God. So most of the people I met who were Muslims were what became this controversial, and still is controversial, Vatican II pronunciation, in which the Catholic Church came out in 1965 or 66 with this shocking statement that the Catholic Church does not own God. Because prior to that, you could not call yourself a Catholic and pray in a Protestant church or a Jewish anything. They had a monopoly, and so okay. And then I also wanted to learn more about the French-Algerian relationship, because I saw then, and I still would say today, that the relationship between, I might say, one of my academic interests were very much drawn, and always have been, to history, because I don't believe you can understand much of anything if you don't have some historical knowledge behind you and your judgments and perspectives. But so I thought, well, I've sold my business. I've got 2 kids. I'm in France. I'd like to keep this relationship not only with France, but with learn more about Algeria and Islam as it's expressed and explained there, and have a relationship with Algeria.
Right.
And
what year? By the way, what kind of time frame is this? Is it like late 90s, early 2000s?
Yeah, it's actually we're talking mid 90s, mid 90s. Because it was 60. I think it was 60. It was 96. 95.
Okay. And yes. So time frame wise, you finished the Cold War, and then we go right into the first Iraq War with George Herbert Walker Bush.
Yeah,
And that's kind of what, and then you have the World Trade bombings, 94. So that's what you're starting to see. Yeah. Okay.
Exactly. But I was interested in getting my insights from French monks in Algeria whose history was at least 2 or 3 generations old, going back to 1841 when they sent the first Trappist monks over there. Why? Because Muslims back in those days, and still today, who thought, well, what's wrong with these Frenchmen? They don't pray, they don't go to church, they're atheists. What's wrong with these people? Send us some. So I forget which general it was. Said, well, we can fix that. We got a few monks. We'll bring them over here to show we're godly people and we pray, we believe in God, and so you've had 160 years of not quite that many, 100 and was that 60 years of French, not occupation, but French living, by and large, happily, productively, and appreciatively by 99% of the Muslims and Algerians. So this whole relationship between the church and in the eyes of some of them, the infidels and vice versa, but most of it is just be a good person and appreciate the gifts that God has given us. And so I found that it was very ironic that the French army was frequently criticized. I think this came particularly after the what was that? The uprising in 1870. But anyway, when those are the last of the uprisings. But when the colonists would say, don't put up the cross in the hospitals because they build hospitals for everybody.
Yep.
And they said, you'll offend the colonists. And they said, no, it's just the opposite. They want us to be here. They like the fact that we believe in Jesus and we believe in Mary, who's a perfect person. Actually, she's just not God. I mean,
yeah.
How many people know that? If you're a sort of at least an Orthodox consumer of the Quran, it says that she's was mentioned 99 times or 89 times. There was a whole chapter on her, and you want to insult the Muslim, insult Mary. I mean, it was just all counter to everything. And then I met Muslims who had been in Germany, and they were amazed that the Old Testament basically has the same standards of conduct as Muslims. So it was just an eye-opening sense of just don't cave into preconceptions until you've done. And so much of what we do and think about other countries, other cultures, is driven by simplistic preconceptions, some of which have some validity, like usually, but then they color everything. If you're of a mindset that complexity is confusing to a lot of people, and life seems to be easier if you simplify. Yeah. And maybe for a short period of time it will, but in the long term, and the people who are most adamant about being sophisticated were generally the military guys who were in Somalia and in Vietnam. I mean, we did something intelligent in Vietnam by setting up these units, but the Marine Corps created called community action. Combat action. Community. What the hell is it called now? But what happened is they created these village units where the Marines would live for months with the locals and integrate with them. Mm-hmm. It was very successful, but Westmoreland preferred bombs and headlines, and that has not been repeated since then.
So was there the Algerians in France that introduced you to Emir Abd el-Kader?
No, it was that. Well, no, it was actually indirectly. I'd gotten back to the United States, and there had been a big story in Paris Match about the murder of the monks.
Okay.
And I said, "Ooh, that's interesting," because these monks must have been pretty good people, and what were they doing there? And it would be interesting to learn about Islam via the experience, perceptions, sensibilities of these monks whose order had been there since 1841. So they obviously were in good hands most of the time because they're still there, even if they lost a few along the way.
Yeah.
And then I thought, well, now I like adventure. I like trying out new things, and I've never been to Algeria, so I went back to France and I talked to a number of people, and the one who was the most important was the general de Chergé, who was the father of one of the monks, Christian de Chergé, who was a huge Islamophile and appreciated their culture and wanted to learn more about it. And so I thought, well, maybe I should go over there and see what's going on, write a story. And then so the story started really in Paris, talking to an editor and talking to the parents of the monks who had been killed, and told them my mission, and which was to sort of bring my own relatively neutral, if not positive, attitude towards Islam, but not knowing much. And they signed off and gave me their blessing, and I went to Algiers. I think it was 2001, and to meet Algerians and learn something. And the great irony of that first toe dip into Algeria was that I arrived, and I guess it was planned, on a day in which they were doing a whole celebratory week of discussion and comment and analysis of the influence of St. Augustine. This is our, and they said, in which Muslims are saying that we are, the church is part of our culture, part of our history. The Augustinian message is the same as ours. And we love Augustinians. Now, yeah, probably a few here and then didn't know for good reasons, but whatever. So that's what my first encounter was with people, Muslims, talking about the importance and the need for Christians and Muslims to know each other, talk to each other, ask each other questions. But it was mainly young students at the college, at the university there, who were saying we need to work together to help Muslims understand our faith and vice versa, and very positive. And that remained the case until what was it, 96. And so I went over there and went to the monks of Tibhirine up in the Atlas, south of Algiers, and met people in the community. Told them, well, I didn't meet them in the community because they were dead, but I went to the community and there were a few gardeners and maintenance people, and got the story from inside of Algeria. And it was very. People would say, "Are you afraid? Were you, it was dangerous?" And I said, "Well, yeah. I mean, but I just followed the advice that I was given by Bishop Tessier." And he said, "My main thing is when you go up the valley there, don't stay too close behind the buses, because 2 weeks before, the GIA types or whoever they were, they'd blown up a bus." So that was his response when I asked the question, well, should I follow Father Amadei? Because he said we should check in with the ministry and get them to sign off and give permission. And Tessier said, don't bother with that. That'll take months, and you get there much faster. Just don't go too close to the buses if you're following them.
Right.
And very pragmatic. And it was when they have a very nice, beautiful graveyard there, mostly visited by Muslims, the neighbors, and it's a love fest with some sad killings. And on the day that they had the funeral in Algiers, they had the National Guard, or a honor guard, carrying the bodies of the sarcophagi up to the church, and just pouring out their embarrassment, their shock, their horror that Muslims would kill these wonderful, beautiful people who'd given their whole lives
Mm-hmm.
to help people, mostly Algerian, to live better lives and
Sure.
give shelter and be a friend and be a. So it was a real eye opener to learn from Tessier that he had bags and bags of letters saying we're ashamed of we didn't protect our monks and so on. So there was a great bond there that never was particularly appreciated until, frankly, I wrote a book about the first book I wrote having to do with Algeria was The Monks of Tibhirine, Faith, Love, and Terror in Algeria, and that became a film, and maybe you saw it. It was called the Monks. I think it was called. What was it called? Yes, of Gods and Men.
Of Gods and Men. I'll look it up.
Of Gods and Men. There, that was it was made by a Frenchman, but he basically took 99% of the information and used it for his movie, and acknowledged his thanks to Kaiser and all of that. But so it was a double testimonial to the positive. The positive side of the French-Algerian relationship, and I think that's the big problem is that it's always a lump sum thing. It's either they hate us, and now it's much more complicated. And the old colonists are mostly, I guess, dying off. So the new generation of Frenchmen who haven't gone through a nightmare but have more open minds, I think it's a reason to be hopeful. And actually, I wrote a letter to Macron a year ago suggesting that there's never going to be real peace and harmony without the prerequisite quality, which you have to be able to forgive on both sides. I mean, you try to start tallying up who did the most atrocities, who were the baddest of the bad. You can go on forever, but without forgiveness, and that was well received by him, and I think that's a course to continue.
Oh, you got a response from him?
Yeah, he sent me a letter.
Oh, really? Okay.
So, and we hope to continue that discussion.
Yeah, because I think today France has this. There's still this perception. It's funny because you keep mentioning Algeria and France, right? And some of the most famous Frenchmen are Algerians, like Zinedine Zidane, especially with the World Cup final. Being tomorrow. We're recording a day before the World Cup final. And you have like these French players who are like have Muslim backgrounds.
Yeah,
well, you know what I mean. But it's funny because you like Emir Abd el-Kader, because you think about Europe being irreligious today, but even when you read your book, you're seeing there's like France has this like really like antagonistic relationship with religion as a whole. Like Emir Abd el-Kader says, like, when I began my terrible struggle with the French, I thought they had no religious feeling. Because of of their own history and whatnot. So it's always been this dynamic there. I think it seems like.
Well, yeah. I mean, and it's understandable because the church was involved in all sorts of horrible behavior in the Middle Ages, and then it's torture chambers for the Protestants, and you go to what is it in the south of France? Not south of France. What am I thinking here? Where they had the torture chambers.
Yeah, but
in the Cathar country, yeah,
I got you.
Yeah, that was.
So basically, you're in Algeria. You're seeing these monks were killed by these like extremists, right? And but the general populace was very upset about it, and they were mourning the loss of these monks who were basically there to help them out, and serve them. It's not these and just to clarify, these monks aren't like these missionary types. They've been there for a long time. There's been a tradition of these monks being in Algeria, right?
Yeah, they also knew that they knew enough about Islam that trying to convert them would not be welcome, and there was some of that going on. But certainly the Trappists understood that
right.
You want to stay healthy, don't try to convert. But the relations were very good.
Yeah. Okay. And then I assume at this point you probably the Emir Abd el-Kader name probably first came to your
Yeah, my attention. Well, this the prior of the monastery. He was actually reading about Abd el-Kader. He had it on his bedside in his cell, and that was one of his pieces of property when they, found some of the remnants. But he agitated some of the other monks who weren't crazy about having to so much talk about Islam. So there, even within that small community, there were different flavors of pro or neutral, or I wouldn't say negative, but there are a lot of people who read this one or two chapters. They hear one or two people talk in a certain way, and then they generalize. And I just think that yes. So they. So that gave me the idea of well, let's see. I just finished this book. Let's see, when did that come out?
You're talking about the book about the monks. You finished that book first.
Yeah, that was But then as that was winding down, and I was sort of saying goodbye to some of the sisters in Algiers, where they had a rest home and sort of a place where people could, Christians and non-Christians, could spend time. But I remember asking, what is this who's this Abd el-Kader guy? Because the monastery itself was right at the foot of this rather large mountain, and it was called Abd el-Kader Rock. And that's when, well, he's sort of our George Washington. Oh, really? And that's interesting. I'd like to learn more about him. And so then I went back to Algiers, and I mentioned this to one of the sisters, and she came back to me a little bit later and said, "Oh, Mr. Kaiser, I understand you're interested in the Emir. Well, I have this book of his. I love it. I keep it by my bedside. And, you ought to know about it." And that's when I said, "Great, I'd like to learn more." And so next day or same day was right after, she gave me a piece of paper, which is what really actually changed my life. Not earth shaking, but it changed my attitude about a lot of things.
Yep.
But it summed up what young, old, Christian, non-Christian, atheist, virtually everybody who has read this one paragraph comes away feeling good about the idea of God and believing in God without demonizing people who do, and vice versa. So here's, if you don't mind, I will just read 3 or 4 sentences.
Sure.
But it's a universalist attitude, basically.
Okay.
Yeah, like a Vatican II. Mm-hmm. If you think God is what the different communities, Muslims, Christians, Jews, Zoroastrians, polytheists, others, he is that, but he is more. If you think and believe that the prophets, the saints, and the angels, he is that, but he is still more. None of his creatures, this is the clincher for a lot of people, including myself, none of his creatures worships him in his entirety. No one is an infidel in all the ways relating to God. No one knows all God's facets. Each of his creatures worships and knows him in a certain way and is ignorant of him in others. Error does not exist in this world except in a relative manner, i.e., we're all wrong if we think we know God in its entirety. So it's just wonderfully inclusive and recognizing that God is bigger than whatever we think it is. And I remember hearing a Muslim imam, or I forget what his rank was, but he was, I think, connected to Mastaganem, saying that one of the problems with Muslims is, which we didn't say the whole, I'm adding this, but he said the problem with non-Muslims is they can't understand that God is more than what they can can grasp. It's I can only grasp what I can grasp, and that must be what God is. Well, no, the fact that you can't grasp God is a good sign, because it means God is greater than whatever we could come up with. And similarly with Christians and others, it's you you have sort of humble Christians who Trappist type, who make allowances for the idea that God is in my way anyway. God is like a really good a really good McDonald's. Really smart, because he understands that in different places in the world, different times, men and women have different needs. So you evolve your message. It adapts. It changes. It's not the same all the time. And it has different. You have different consumers, different people with different needs and understanding. But it's so that God is something that is beyond understanding, all understanding, but it's also God is in all things, and all things are in God. So if you take that attitude, and that's sort of Ibn Arabi, I think that then God sleeps in the rocks, stirs in the plants, and so it's everything is God infused, but God's not just cauliflower. God's also meat, and so it's much more rational. It's inclusive, and it doesn't really. I don't think most people are offended by it, except those who say, yes, for my money, the people who are problem creators, but also solvers to some extent. But those who say, no, it's Jesus, only Jesus. If you don't go through the Jesus hole to get to heaven, then if you don't accept that, then you're never going to get to heaven. And I just don't think that makes it for kind of a restrictive, small-minded God, in my view.
Well, I think that this point, because when I read your book, and you see Emir Abd el-Kader, first of all, he has no understanding of Christianity at all, right? And then he starts meeting with these monks and these priests and like reading the Bible a little bit and asking questions about why do you believe Jesus is God and things of that sort. And then his exposure to Ibn Arabi, right? I still think we have to differentiate. So from a Muslim point of view, I think we have a lot more flexibility, because at the end of the day, I think that I think about like Islam or religion or something. It's like a playbook for life with an end goal of hopefully some kind of salvation and some afterlife, right? However, not everyone's gonna get the same circumstances. You know what I'm saying? People are put in different parts of the world. We're not exposed to different things. So I feel like the one point that I really agree with, kind of what Emir Abd el-Kader is talking about, is like, God does judge every individual individually. There is no like, maybe not a formula, so to speak. There's maybe a path to get there, but at the end of the day, it's a lot of circumstances that go into play, right? And I think that's and my understanding of the Islamic tradition and theology kind of correlates with that as well. But at the same time, we still obviously people want converts, right? Christians want converts, Muslims want converts, because they feel like it allows them to live a good life, and possibly a life of virtue that hopefully puts them on the path to hopefully get some salvation. Whereas you're kind of like, so but there's a lot of, I agree with you. There's not, it's not really black and white. It's black, making things black and white makes it convenient for people, but also like doesn't really we have this discussion all the time about like Muslims who have like non-Muslim relatives, right? And when they pass away, should we pray for them and all this kind of stuff? And it's in a lot of my Muslim friends who are converted, they struggle with it a lot, right? Because of there's all this different messaging going around. But yeah, so I see the appeal of it for sure. It still, I think it makes people uncomfortable. Ibn Arabi makes people uncomfortable, but people say that scholars, that Ibn Arabi is someone that should be read, because he uses a lot of like metaphorical phrasing and things of that sort to like, so you have to understand where he's coming from. And there's probably a lot, but sometimes the translation is also sometimes kind of can get lost in it. But in general, I agree with you that there's kind of like people when they want to box God into their little thing, and like not with, they might learn a religion for like a week or two or a year, and be like, this is it. And then anything outside of that is like, and I think that requires a lot for us to overcome. You know what I mean?
But it depends, I guess, also how you go in when your
Yeah.
mindset. I mean,
Right.
one of the other phrases in the Quran that I really like is that if God wanted us to all be the same, He would have made it that way. But instead,
Right.
He created, tribes and nations
Right.
so that they could benefit from each other. I mean, that
Sure.
to me is a highly
Yeah.
logical. It's commercial. If you
Yep.
want to think commercially,
Right.
it's however. This is this guy who's saying, "Hey,
Yeah.
God doesn't just want to have people, sucking on lollipops. There are lots of other things out there too."
Sure.
So I
Absolutely.
think one is more rational to me, but for others, it's not.
So I know you got to run to a doctor's appointment. We only covered one question so far of the 5, so we're gonna have to probably do a part 2. But before we wrap up here, why don't you leave everyone with like a teaser of why, if you could summarize why Abdul Kader is irrelevant. Okay, first of all, real quick, when did you hear about Al Qaeda, Iowa, the city?
I learned about it actually in Algiers
Okay.
on my first visit in this. I think that was 2001,
Okay.
and I met an Algerian who had let's see, I guess he was stationed in he was living in Algeria, and
Right.
he was in the U.S. embassy there,
Right.
and he came across this article about Al Qaeda and said, "Wow, it's amazing! In America, they got this town named after our national hero."
Mm.
And I got to talk to the boss about this, and then she says, "Oh yeah, go. You have permission to go down there and find out more." So we did, and
Okay.
then they wrote an article, and then a lot of people said, "Oh, we should cultivate this," and that's so. But that was before Les Années Noires, or the darkest of the Années Noires. That was in '85 or '84. Kathy Garms was then the sort of the mayor sorts, and she was tickled pink to have this interest, and they created a sister city program, which was still sort of a novel way of building bridges. And then I guess it was in '88 or '89, the Algerian government said, "This is, I don't know, this is getting pretty dicey. Maybe we shouldn't be, uh, or you Americans shouldn't be sending your people here, and maybe we should wait for this to kind of cool off." And so it took another 10, 15 years to cool off, but they thought for security reasons would put it on hold after the first year or two. And now it's back and it's thriving, and we've got a whole project built with Kathy Garms and myself. But then we've drawn in teachers and business people, but mainly the educational world that's been informed of this man's story. And I launched the book about him in El Kader with Kathy, who organized the reception, if you will. And you read the beginning of the book there, where it talks about the coach.
Right.
Yeah. So it's been a slow growth process and an anomaly, and overwhelmingly welcome.
Yeah. No, I was thinking about this morning, as I was thinking about getting mentally ready for the interview. I was like, could this exist? Like, because he's only 100. He's really 150 years removed from us, right?
Well,
And,
he died in what, in 70, was it 72? 83. Yeah, 1883.
yeah. So roughly, yeah.
So 1883. So what's that? That's 120, 30, 37.
Yeah. I would say around, give or take 150 for like, and so it's like, could this person exist? Like, I was thinking about, okay, let's say, imagine you had a person who's living in Iraq or Afghanistan or some land that was invaded by the U.S. military under some imperial neocon agenda, right? And they had this person of virtue who comes out of it. Obviously, the first initial reaction would be, this guy's a terrorist, this, et cetera. And then that changes over time. So I think it could work. I think that's the important, that's what I got out of the book, at least, is that like, it's extremely practical because it's so close in time, and the interaction with like the Western world and how he navigates that with both like politics and religion.
Yeah, I don't even the navigating. One of your questions had to do with what are his primary or most important
Virtues.
virtues, and,
Yeah.
and I would say um, probably number one, but would be his ability to empathize,
Mm.
and it wasn't a boundary. I mean, he could even put himself in the shoes of the officers, some of the officers who didn't treat him very well or had very
Sure.
negative opinions, but he. That's one of the things we don't do well at all. Ask ourselves, well, why would somebody want to blow up, two towers in New York? They must have been pretty angry or something, I mean, but we don't empathize. I mean, talk to anybody in the
Yeah.
military about that.
Right.
Just go in, destroy, leave, and then
Yeah.
bigger mess. So, and then I also think that his, he had incredible. He was also believed in obedience, and he, and that came from his parents. What's interesting, an interesting question though, which I have not investigated, is he did have two brothers, or was it three? Or he had a sister and two brothers, but his father was a very highly regarded wise man, respected for his good judgments in settling divisions and arguments, and I don't know if you remember, but when the what do you call the guy who's the mayor? Uh, when the who is the who's the chief in Iran in Oran, who came down and wanted to
Oran.
wanted shelter. Asked the
Oh, I know you're talking the name. I get all the names we're getting mixed up, but I remember you're talking about. Yeah.
What was his name? Yeah,
Bey Hassan.
Yeah, Bey Hassan, right? Because he pissed off a lot of people by being too harsh and too aggressive, collecting taxes and all that, and then so he knew that, and so he said, that you're Aman, so you protected me under your wing,
right?
And the Emir's father, in this case, being an elderly man and reflective, and he said, yes, it's our job to be generous towards our neighbors, and particularly ones that are under threat, and you're a part of our culture, and da da da. And they had this conclave of elderly men with the beards saying, yes, that's our duty to be forgiving, And then they stopped, and then the young Emir, he says, well, I don't know, this was his first participation in a session like this, says, well, think about this. What you are doing is potentially setting us up for a real embarrassment, because we cannot control the tempers of the other tribes who've been abused by these harsh treatments in the past, when they were, pulling teeth, so to speak, to get the money they wanted. And our reputation, and we going to actually be able to protect the people are Aman.
Right. Yeah.
And they all sort of nodded. Well, good point, sonny boy. Maybe you got a point there. And it was all done quietly, politely, no yelling and screaming. It's just a young man picking up on his father's own sensibilities.
Yep.
But saying, "Hey, Dad, wait a minute, you didn't thought this thing through quite far enough."
Right.
And so that's an indicator of a lot of things. But one is an indicator of, again, a sense of empathy. But the empathy is for the people who had been abused by Hassan's men, want more money. So and obedience is also stressed as is part of life. If you don't have order, if you don't have relationships that are properly aligned, everybody doing it, you need, and the military knows that, good, well-run families, I think, do, because they may not beat their kids or have to. But I mean, I think in any organization there is usually a hierarchy of some kind. It can be soft, it can be hard, it can be in between, but hierarchy is part of life, and so.
All right.
Yeah.
Well, John, I think we're at time. I know you got to run. We have to do a part 2 because we have most of the questions we didn't get through. And you told me on the phone that, hey, I don't know that I can talk for that long, and we spent 35 minutes on one question, so
I like the idea that you're willing to accept depth, because it's very rare in the U.S. to have a long conversation, because everybody's looking at their watch, so thank you for your patience, and I can say that the Emir is not alone. There are many other Emir-like figures, but few that combine all the other qualities that he, which is incredible. Resilience and fighting ability. I mean, he wasn't sitting in Tampa, controlling things from 5,000 to 10,000. He was in the front ranks, And you know how your soldiers were judged as being brave or not?
How's that?
How many horses did they lose?
Yeah, right.
That's a measure of your engagement.
So what I was going to say is, last time we had spoken we were talking about Emir Abd el-Kader's empathy as far as one of the virtues, and then we had you had mentioned something about what was it? His universalist approach to people and religion. I'd like you to expound a little bit about that, because I think we started talking about it, but then because of the time constraint, we weren't really able to kind of wrap it up or tie up some loose ends.
Yeah. Well, I think what makes him universal is in a spiritual sense, in that he doesn't believe any religious orientation is such that one could say my religion is the only religion that you can worship in and still be saved. And we know some of the Christians behave that way or talk that way, and so do, I imagine, some of the other faith systems. So you have a sort of a spread of open, God is God, there's no God but God. And I like the way the Emir expresses himself. It's short and pithy and easy to understand. As far as his empathy is definitely a subset, I think, of all the virtues that one can have in life, and it's an important one. It's not an easy track, and we're having a lot of difficulty today in the United States, in Russia, and Ukraine to understand Russia's point of view on their history. So what makes him a universalist is that he would say God doesn't exclude anyone.
Right. Go ahead. Are you there? Okay. Yeah. So I would say, when I'm reading the book, I don't know that I understand. So I think, first of all, in the American context of religion, I feel like modern evangelical Christianity has created some kind of framing where it's either my way or the highway, right? And that's how we as Americans first understand religion. It's like, my religion is right, and if it's right, that means you all are going to hell if you don't take it, right? It's I feel like, very black and white. Obviously, Emir Abd el-Kader isn't that. However, I also don't know that he's saying that all religions will lead to salvation, because that almost is not an Islamic worldview either. You get what I'm saying? And then we can kind of pick that apart a little bit, because within Islam, there's just like, because what you're saying that Emir Abd el-Kader is a proponent of is something what we Noah's what they call the perennialist worldview, which is like all the religions are there's different paths, right? I think what Emir Abd el-Kader is saying from the book, and maybe I'm reading my biases into the book, and maybe you have a worldview that you're reading into when you're writing the book, and we can talk about it. I feel like what he's saying is that, like, certainly God would have, if God wanted everyone to become Muslim or Christian or whatever faith, he could have made them all, right, the same faith, but he didn't. He gave people different backgrounds to learn from each other. But then when you talk about, like, as what is the straight path, so Muslims, we believe that all the prophets received revelation from God, and then eventually things were changed and whatnot. And we believe that Islam is the final test, is the revelation, and that's the one that is kind of preserved, right? And that's how you have these different religions. And so I think I think he's saying that Islam is the true religion. However, I also think he's saying that he doesn't condemn others based on their faith, because as Muslims we can't. Does that make sense? You know what I'm saying? Because we, at the end of the day, I don't know. Like, let's say, John, you're not a Muslim. You're not Muslim, right? I just want to make sure. Yeah, right. I couldn't condemn you because I don't know your circumstances, and the only person who knows that is God, right? And on for judgment, that's the one who matters, and that's who, like, knows all that stuff and can assess everyone. Even for myself, like, we don't necessarily say, like, I can't tell you that, oh, I know I'm going to heaven straight shot. You get what I'm saying? Like, I believe that okay, this is the pathway, but how I'm doing it, I don't know. I might be a hypocrite for all I know. I could be judged as a hypocrite. You get what I'm saying? So I think that's where the difference is. So there's a lot, the Islamic faith, I think, has a lot of nuance built in that Emir Abd el-Kader gets to apply when he finally meets non-Muslims, like Catholics and Christians and priests. And then it all, like, kind of vibes with them. And the teachings of Ibn Arabi align with that, right? So I think that's where, but I think the problem we have in America is sometimes we've bought into this black and white nature of religion, that it's my way, and if you don't accept my way, like a Christian guy could tell me, like, and it's happened. He's like, if you don't accept Jesus, you're going to hell. If you die, you're going to hell. Like, whereas with him, I couldn't say that. I can't say to him, like, hey, if you get hit by a truck right now and you're a Christian, I can't promise you that you're going to hell. You know what I'm saying? Like, I know does that make sense?
Well, I don't know if it makes sense, but it's certainly one form of relationship with
the
divine, which is there's only one path, and but what's amusing about that is that Muslims have a great affection for Jesus as a prophet, and they don't even see Judgment Day doesn't even occur until who returns, right? Jesus.
Right. Sure. Absolutely. Yeah.
There's nothing particularly exclusionary, and what I like about the Emir is his attitude of nobody knows all the answers.
Yep.
Where there's no one answer to what is creation, who is God, why do we all of the different expressions of respect for a higher power, which is, I thought, a good way the British addressed the subject when they were trying to use religion in a constructive way to cure and address alcoholism. But rather than calling God a name, they basically say, whatever your personal relationship with God is, that's your business, So, and if it provides you with satisfaction and dealing with different issues and problems in your life, alcoholism being one, and a lot of the things that the Christian or Western community I don't appreciate, because, like myself, most people don't know much about the other faiths, but there's some inherent medical
benefits from being a Muslim if you practice your faith regularly, because stretching your back, not drinking alcohol, having a sort of a regularity, a ritualistic regularity that keeps reminding you of. They're more like Benedictine monks in many ways.
Mm-hmm.
So there's just a tremendous amount of overlap, and it doesn't really, make sense to try to, pigeonhole God. But it's how you define things, what your needs are.
Right. Yeah.
So I don't really. What made me realize what an incredible religion Islam can. And Islam, by the way, doesn't mean religion. Islam means submission to but is. My back has tapped me on the back here, and I'm trying to regain my train of thought here.
You're talking about Islam is not a religion; it's submission.
Yeah, well, it's all part of one religious tradition.
Yeah, right.
Judaism, Christianity,
yeah,
all of whom make their origin
right.
Right.
Yep.
Abraham, the Abrahamic faith is the underlying basis for the three faiths, and I think that you would be a very small God if one tradition, one set of precepts, it encompasses everything.
For sure. All right, so I want to go on and move on to the next question. So you write in the book how the Emir relies on his faith in Islam and his understanding of the law in his politics, as a governing principle, right? Now, in today's secular age, people are uncomfortable with combining religion and politics, maybe for good reason. So how would you use his life to convince like a modern secularist on the value of having a politician with strong religious values?
Because of his openness.
Okay.
His openness to different expressions of faith. And they all essentially boil down to the same thing, which is treat other people the way you want to be treated. You will come across citations of Rabbi Hillel when he was asked by the pagan, tell me what your religion is about. While I'm standing on one foot. He said, well, that which is harmful to you, don't do to others. All else is detail. Go forth and study. And every study process will probably address different aspects of the reality that we live in. But there's still an underlying sameness of seeking tranquility, seeking wisdom, being humble. I think humility is one of the most, unfortunately, one of the most absent of the virtues. And so, to me, faith is a sort of is a way of getting beyond this idea of ownership, right?
Right.
If you think you own God, then you don't really understand what the higher power really is, because it's beyond our ability to grasp.
Right.
But if it helps us be more charitable, if it helps us be more humble, if it helps us be more obedient. Obedience isn't a very popular word these days, particularly not in the U.S. I think it still is. It's still very much more a Muslim idea, I think, in terms of practice. That's It's, rules are rules. Now, some rules are better than others, but there is this whole brouhaha about Afghan women and others, Arabs, they're being forced to be punished for their dress. Well, yeah, the same's true in other cultures too. It may not be for dress, but you have to wear clothes.
Right.
And men have Arab men have to adhere to certain standards of short pant lengthness and certain. So we're very one-sided in the way we look at the world, but not everybody's the same, and there are. It seems it's harder for the European mind to develop a different view because Europe suffered, as has other places, but some of the atrocities that were done in the name of Islam and post and pre the Protestant Revolution, which was a rebellion against the papacy, makes it clear that it was turned into a weapon, a political weapon as well. So you combine, we know what's right, and this is, you're deviant and you need to be punished, burned at the stake. And so it's incredible. So sort of rational people, I would say rational people who look at the whole picture would say, what kind of God would, want to burn somebody at the stake because they didn't say their prayers the right way.
Right.
So I just, to me, the Emir opens up diversity and is not punitive.
Right. So I think the way I was thinking about this, because with our politicians in America, right? And let's just take a Christian politician as an example. And the distrust people have these days. I feel like a lot of times politicians are very, they're very much talk and not a lot of action. They'll talk about like their faith openly, but then they'll get caught up in some scandal. And I feel like if people saw more action and then happened to find out this was a person of faith, you'd have a better situation.
Yeah, I mean, people who don't sort of wear their faith on their sleeve and advertise it, but I think humility in whatever form and whatever faith, I think the essence of faith is the belief that we acknowledge our limitations and follow what we're presented with, and as the way you're supposed to show a path of respect. And that's one of the main reasons I'm actually sitting here today is because 10 years ago, almost 10 years ago, not quite 10, I guess 8 years ago, and when the book came out, one of the first emails I received was from Sayyid Said.
From Islam.
And what this 2-line note said was astonishing to me, because he said, "Carry on, Christian soldier. We Muslims will follow you." And it made me think about what it meant to be a Christian, what he was trying to say. He wasn't being an apostate. He was just saying that we have the same basic beliefs, and to have a person recognized as a Muslim calling a Christian calling a Christian a Muslim, in essence saying you're a good Muslim. Well, why am I a good Muslim? Because you have written in a way that is respectful of the faith. It's more or less accurate for any book that size. There's a tone that I seem to have respected because I didn't divide it up into good guys and bad guys, but there were more or less of that in different situations. But when it came to behavior on the ground, he's pretty hard to beat, and he have a Muslim be the pioneer in protecting rights of or protecting abuse of people who will fall in battle and leaving just struggling and suffering and dying on the battle. That's inhumane. It's not Muslim. It's not something we can respect, and we need to do something about it, particularly if they've been captured and we're abusing them in the tents where they're being held until we can figure out what to do with them next time.
Right.
And so he's I think is very capable of seeing things through other people's lenses. Doesn't necessarily mean he approves. And one of the best examples is his deep disappointment that Lemoysier, the general that he surrendered to, or really surrender, but he parlayed with, and did the deal with, and was in fact, a very enlightened, forward-thinking French officer. He respected the customs, and he respected the language, and he also understood that you're going to do better in a country where you learn the language and meet the locals and understand the culture you're in, and develop some sophistication about who you're interacting with. So he sorry, man.
No, I got you.
But let me just finish because I wish to say that. So he was bitterly disappointed when, after being held for a short period of time in Po, I guess it was, I think, but getting a note to the effect that Lemoysier did not stand by his oath, I guess you could call it, and who he expected to aid the process of liberating him, because that was part of the package.
Yep.
But so he was furious, and he wrote that long letter, which you probably haven't memorized, but it's still there.
Right.
In which he basically, I forgot the adjective that he used, but he was deeply disappointed, and that he hoped that he would be cursed and his wife would curse him, that she would be cursed by himself and by his wife, and recognize that he had betrayed his own word in the negotiation process, in which he came across as enlightened. But the reason that happened, main reason, I think, was that popular opinion in France was generally very anti-Muslim and anti-Abd el-Kader, and anti doing anything nice to this guy that caused gas pains for 15 years. So he vented, but then at the same time he also said, but I understand his dilemma, because his dilemma was he had his personal feelings, but he was now working under a government that didn't share his enlightened view, and I guess he wanted to keep his job a little longer.
Sure. Right.
So these are, I think that there are situations where you can wonder why didn't he? Well, anyway, I don't want to keep going on.
No, but I think what's always amazing in the book is that it seems like every Frenchman he ran into really took a liking to him.
Yeah, and some of them converted to Islam when he was in jail.
Right. Well, wasn't one guy like a fake? He like it was like a who's the what? There was one guy who said he converted, and he wanted to marry somebody, but then he ended up that wasn't really true.
Yeah, that was a French soldier, and then
Yeah.
but he's not sure whether he came in as a spy
Right.
under the pretext of
Right.
wanting to change sides because he probably got better food and other things.
Who knows? The thing of it, the other thing I was thinking about is with when you talk about politics, Emir Abd el-Kader kind of rose to leadership. He's very differential. He didn't want the leadership positions. It kind of just like, I mean, his father was obviously like the tribe leader, but he seemed to be very differential versus like most politicians today. They have to campaign. They're talking about why they're the best and why someone else sucks. You know what I mean? So I think that's almost like the system almost is almost inverted in a way of how politicians rise.
Well, it's the difference between good politicians and not so good ones. I mean, they have different styles that are tailored to the environments and what they think will appeal
Right.
to the voters. So I really need to get off fairly soon, just because I've got this problem. And if you'd like me to send you any information or notes and answers to questions, there's one question though that you did ask that I wanted to mention, and that was the very brutal description of how Muslims and how the Quran and how faith requires
The executions.
not the certain executions.
Right.
It's the executions that were carried out in the name of punishing people who betrayed the faith.
Yep.
Not who went to the wrong side, but who switched sides.
Right.
So the whole idea of community, maintaining a sense of community adhesion, being loyal to your community, whether it's this or that one, but it's a community that you want to preserve, presumably, and not destroy. And one of the worst things you can do is commit treason by, at least in North Africa at the time, is by whether they betray you. I mean, you have people like your school teacher who was very learned, very knowledgeable, but he wanted to make a little extra money on the side, or he was playing, a couple of games at once here, but he was a good teacher, and B, he was a thief. And being a thief he wasn't even a thief. It was worse than that, because he was helping the enemy. It's one thing to just sell your horse and get paid for the meat or whatever, but in this case, so he, so the punishment, he didn't make it up. It's in the Quran, as I recall. It's you have that, Demerol, do you have that surah? Anyway, there's a surah. It's I think the chapter. I should have brought the Quran verse that I'm referring to, but your listeners probably know what it is. But it basically says that this is the punishment, and it included, lopping off an ear, an arm, a hand, a foot. I mean, it was sort of a gradual mincing up of somebody to make it as painful as possible without actually killing you outright. And I think what that represented, and that was his father, not the Emir himself. His father followed that particular command from the Quran, and So when the Emir returned, he wasn't yet the Emir at that point, and asked, where's my teacher? What happened? And Father explains, he violated the worst thing you can do, which is betrayal when you're pretending to be. So we more or less, believe the same thing often, but not maybe quite as brutal. And so that was his acceptance of a Quranic teaching, if that's what it is, was shocking to most people, and I guess many Muslims who've never read the book completely or pondered it. But given the times, I would think it's it's one way to get a message out that you don't do this. And so it's, if you really want to set an example, you're more often than not probably going to do it by, at least in that era, maybe by fear rather than just let's reason this out together and
right.
Stay in the tent an extra couple of weeks, and we'll give you some water.
Yeah. I mean, when you first learned of that, though, did you have like a visceral reaction, or you were like, "Oh, that makes sense"? Oh, okay.
Yeah, no, I did. I was amazed that the Quran had a verse. It's I think it's the fifth. So that's. So yeah, he could be very hard and harsh when he felt that was justified by the circumstances of the crime committed. And the other big crime in his mind, I think, is betrayal, betraying your own word. That if you make a commitment, you keep it.
Right.
You don't fiddle around, and he would say frequently, "My word is sacred," and some of the French generals actually believed that, and that is, in fact, that's the key thing that made this transaction possible with Lamoisière, because Lamoisière had been in campaign since 1831, and so he had a lot of experience. He had a lot of interaction with Arab and non-Arab, chieftains, and he and so when he saw that the Emir had made this commitment to lay down his arms, not stir up trouble, not call in people from outside when he's gone, and he because he believed in the value of the Emir's word, and that's it'd be a little bit like Americans being asked to take the word of Osama bin Laden that he'd never knock down another tower again.
Right.
So it's a huge asset for anyone who values their word and lives by a faith that gives it value.
Sure.
So he didn't play politics with his religion.
For sure. All right. Well, if you got nothing else, John, I know you're not feeling the best. So before we wrap up here, what's the best, if someone wants to learn more about the Emir, obviously I would recommend the book. If they want to get in touch with you, I know you do speaking arrangements. You're going overseas, I hear, upcoming soon, right?
Well, if my current condition improves, yeah. But it's right now, bad backs aren't fun, and I guess in a bumpy airplane, it's less fun.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's all part of the path.
Yeah.
Right.
But they can visit your website, John.
Yeah. Deborah Ellis reminded me that you could tell people to ask them to visit the website johnwkaiser.com. Let them know that there are two other books, one of which is more relevant than the other, perhaps, of European origin that I've written about, and one is Stefan Zweig, who is, in a way, that's a religious. It's a story of a Jewish intellectual who was sort of embarrassed. A good offset in a way to the Emir, because he was sort of embarrassed by too much sort of, mystical faith beyond stuff, and wanted to just use his mind and his reason and his goodwill as a way to bring people together and live in harmony. Well, you need a little bit more than that, and so he confronted with the Nazi takeover of Germany, and then seeing what that triggered in other parts of Europe, he was sort of horrified that he had to get out of there, because he smelled something pretty bad, and he didn't like it in England either for different reasons. Then he came to New York, and he couldn't work there. He was too distracted, and the environment wasn't quite right. So he ends up going down to Brazil with his new secretary, a young secretary who provided him with the energy and access to the things you need when you're a writer. And he ended up a year later committing suicide. He could have continued. In fact, his Jewish the Jewish community had actually invited him to join their temple, and to be have a camaraderie of communal living and sharing thoughts. So but he didn't feel he was Jewish enough. I think he just was too and then after the Germans had made some serious headway in North Africa, he committed suicide because he hadn't seen any bright lights at the end, and saw that the world was going to fall into darkness, and was depressed because he didn't have anything stronger than some abstract beliefs. But I think for most people who are or most of those systems in which suicide, I think, is generally considered to be a sin, or something that's not approved of from.
Yep.
So this is a situation where loss of faith had something, I think, to do with his difficulty in surviving these dark years, and he didn't get to see the turnaround.
Right.
But he only did it, I think, because his secretary would go with him. I thought personally that he was more likely to not have killed himself if he had to do it alone, because he was weak in some ways.
So, they can get these books through your website, or should they just go through Amazon?
Amazon.
Okay. I'll link them in the show notes then.
Yeah, and then I went on Communist Entrepreneurs, which was another surprise for people back in the 80s, when everybody was trashing Russians and how they couldn't do anything other than make bombs.
Yeah.
Maybe they got other things too that'd be useful.
All right. Well, if that's it, John, I'm going to let you go. For our listeners out there, if you have any questions or comments, you can email me at info@sultansandsneakers.com. For my special guest, John Kaiser, I'm your host, Mahin the Podcaster, signing off.
Okay, and thank you very much for your invitation. And I'm sorry that I was sort of incoherent this morning, but I thought I would at least be a good soldier and show up.
Yeah.
But I'm afraid I haven't put forward a very good presence right now, but I want it to be helpful.
No, I certainly appreciate it, and I hope you get better soon, and hopefully we'll get to meet again in person sometime.
Okay, thank you.
Right. So take care.